Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm so glad to be here. What I'm going to talk about, I guess, is a couple things about environmental issues. I guess I'd talk about what I know about. I was an environmental engineer at Ford for about 20 years in the Rouge from 1988 to 2007. And in that capacity, I did a lot of spill response. So I was on real, the pickle liquor truck hits the train and there's pickle liquor all over the floor, which is an acid, and diesel fuel, and if they hit each other, then something can happen. David knows about the oxidation reaction and explosion. So we had that. We had a big gasoline spill at world headquarters, believe it or not, and it was right when it was snowing. So we had this whole big spill of gasoline, with all covered with this light white snowfall. So we had, and I was in the Rouge for the powerhouse explosion, which 5 people were killed. And Ford Motor Company was fined the biggest fine in the history of MIOSHA, $7.5 million, and all the environmental issues associated with that. So I did that kind of stuff, and then I did regulatory stuff, filling out forms and things. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about, first, kind of how environmental regulation has happened in the United States. And basically, it's crisis management. Something horrible happens, they pass a law to try to make sure it don't happen again. So we had Bhopal, 1984, so they passed a right to know law, which says that every community should know about the chemicals that are in their neighborhood. We had Love Canal, and all kinds of people got sick because they buried all this toxic waste, and then the company went out of business and it bubbled up in people's yards, if anyone remembers that. Yeah. Then they passed RCRA, which was the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which basically is the cradle-to-grave law governing hazardous waste. The Exxon Valdez spill takes place, boom, we get another new law, Oil Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. So this is kind of the method of environmental laws, okay? So no forward thinking, no planning, you got, mess everywhere, and now let's try to pass a law so we can't make this other mess again, number one. Number two, it's completely self-regulated. There has never been an environmental law passed that did not depend on industry to supply the data for the work that they're doing. That's just, it's been that way since the beginning. There have never been any full-time environmental people whose job it was to make sure that permits were enforced. Never been true. So all this stuff was a lot of hooey. It's always been self-regulated. Now there was a time when we were in the Rouge, for example, we had a water permit, and once every 2 years the EPA might come out and go with us when we sample, or the state of Michigan would come by once a year and actually split samples with us. So we would both go out in our vehicles together and we would sample all the points that we're required to sample by law. That was it. And that ended a long time ago in Michigan. Long time ago. So all of the stuff has been self-regulated. In Detroit, we have 50,000 discharges into the water system before it goes to the treatment plant. 750 of those are regulated with permits. Okay, the other 49,000 are not. 50,000 of various types of industrial sources. Yeah, everything from dry cleaners, which, things like that, all the way up to industry. So there's a whole image that's given about environmental regulation that is just not true. And people think that there's all this stuff there. They're much more concerned about getting your taxes, okay, and taking your house away from you than they ever are about the environment, even from the point of view of infrastructure. The most they ever do is get lawyers to try to sue somebody. But there's no people out there regularly doing testing. Now, the city of Detroit tests at these water outfalls that they're regulated by the feds to test. So they do that. But we would always split samples with them too when I worked at Ford. So I think it's really important to realize how little is really regulated independently of the wealthy. Okay, that's sort of the first thing.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you. What do you mean split samples?
Oh, I'm sorry. We would go to a place, and let's say one of the things that we had to do was measure the lead in the water. Okay, so we would set up our unit, and we would take samples for 24 hours, and the city would set up its unit, and it would take samples for 24 hours from the same place. And then we would take those samples, and then we would both analyze samples, so that we would be looking at the same stuff.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry. I did try to not say things that aren't clear to people. So that's so when you realize that, and when regulations first started, there was a lot of, we've got to fix things right away. The actual law is called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. That's the Clean Water Act. Of course, pollution was not eliminated. Okay. At the Rouge, for example, we had discharges of things like we had permit limits of tons of oil and grease every day, that we could discharge. And that was permitted, tons. Because you have a huge place where you're discharging water in 145 million gallons of water a day through an outfall. So you don't need very much oil in 145 million gallons to come up with a ton. So yeah, we had limits like tons, yes. Those limits still those kinds of limits still exist. So that's the one side of it. There really isn't nearly as much control over what happens in the environment as people think. Even, like I said, even if people follow the law. Another side of the law is all the exemptions that industry wins. For example, the oil industry or the coal industry has won exemptions that says that ash from burning coal is non-hazardous. You don't have to test it, okay? It's automatically non-hazardous by law. Okay, I don't care if it'll kill you in 2 seconds. It's non-hazardous by law. Municipal waste, another waste, automatically non-hazardous. I don't care what people throw out the front door. If it's municipal waste and the reason for that was obvious. Hazardous waste costs 10 times what non-hazardous waste costs per ton. So if they had put that law into effect, they would have bankrupted every municipality in the country. So there's all kinds of things about environmental regulation that have to do with adapting to capitalism. That are not dealt with openly and upfront. We didn't decide to exempt municipal trash. We could have said, what we're going to do is we're going to start segregating the bad stuff right away. We're going to work on it together. We're going to sample regularly. We're going to pay. We're going to make sure the bad stuff goes in the bad stuff place. We could have done that, right? We're intelligent people. We can do that, but that's not what's happened. So you wonder why there's no motivation to shut down the incinerator. The waste, it doesn't make any difference. Okay, what goes in the waste? So, and you wonder what's going up the stack, too. Same thing. No control over that waste at all. So that's on the one side. On the other side, should something horrible happen, right, they're supposed to have these contingency plans. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about contingency plans and the kind of thinking that goes into that. And one of the things here is and I'll pass around some of these things. This is Tony Hayward, who is the CEO of British Petroleum, wrote an editorial for the Wall Street Journal. What we're doing about the Gulf Gusher. Okay. Here's what he said. We remain in uncharted territory. None of these approaches, how to fix this problem, has ever been attempted in water a mile deep, where the extreme cold and the intense pressures require experts to carefully adapt proven techniques. Okay. We remain in uncharted territory. They've never done this stuff before. Okay.